The phone rang just after 8 on a rainy Tuesday morning, and the voice on the other end politely asked if my wife, Eleanor Reed, could return 3 overdue library books before additional late fees were added to her account. I stood in my kitchen gripping the coffee mug so tightly that it cracked against the counter. Eleanor had been gone for 6 months. I had folded the flag from her memorial beside our wedding album, packed away her reading glasses, and locked her library card inside the small cedar keepsake box she asked me never to throw away. Yet someone, somehow, had checked out the exact novels she loved only 3 weeks earlier. I knew grief could play cruel tricks on memory, but this wasn't memory. It was a record with dates, barcodes, and a librarian calmly waiting for my answer. If you've ever wondered whether love can leave work unfinished after someone is gone, I hope you'll stay with me a little longer. I apologized to the librarian, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe old habits from the Marine Corps die hard. When something didn't make sense in the warehouse, you never argued with the inventory sheet until you checked the shelf yourself. Paperwork wasn't always right, but it was never wrong without a reason. The librarian introduced herself as Margaret Ellis. Her tone changed the moment I quietly told her Eleanor had passed away the previous autumn. She fell silent long enough for me to hear pages turning somewhere in the background. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Reed," she finally said. "This has to be a database mistake." "I'd like to believe that." She hesitated. "If you're able to come in today, I'd like to look at the account with you." I told her I'd be there within the hour. Driving across town, I kept replaying the call instead of watching the familiar streets. Eleanor had spent more afternoons in that little brick library than anywhere except our own living room. While I was managing warehouse schedules after retiring from the Marines, she volunteered at book sales, organized reading circles, and somehow remembered every child's favorite author. I thought I knew that part of her life. Now I wasn't so sure. Margaret met me before I reached the circulation desk. She looked embarrassed, the kind of embarrassed only honest people become when they cannot explain something. She opened Eleanor's account on her computer, frowned, refreshed the screen twice, then slowly turned the monitor toward me. There it was. 3 recent checkouts. All borrowed after Eleanor's funeral. The titles stopped me colder than the dates. They weren't random novels. They were the exact 3 books Eleanor reread every autumn, always in the same order, always with a pressed maple leaf tucked somewhere between the pages. Margaret whispered, "Mr. Reed, there's something else." She clicked once more. A 4th reservation had already been placed for tomorrow. I stared at the reservation screen long enough for the dates to blur together before Margaret quietly printed the circulation history and slid it across the desk. "I know this looks impossible," she said, lowering her voice as a pair of children hurried past carrying picture books. "Our new catalog software has been giving us trouble since the migration. Accounts that should have remained archived have occasionally reappeared. That's the only explanation I can think of." It sounded reasonable, and the orderly part of my Marine training wanted to accept it. Systems fail. Records become tangled. Mistakes happen. But mistakes rarely imitate a person's habits with such unsettling precision. Whoever had borrowed those books hadn't picked random titles. They had followed Eleanor's reading pattern exactly, even observing the week she always began her annual autumn rereading. That detail belonged to someone who knew her well, or someone who had discovered her routine another way. Margaret asked whether I remembered if Eleanor had ever loaned her library card to anyone. I answered without hesitation. Never. She treated books the way some people treat family heirlooms. Margaret nodded and disappeared into the workroom. When she returned, she carried the first of the recently returned novels inside a clear preservation sleeve. It came back yesterday morning, she explained. Since the account was flagged after my call, I thought you might want to see it before we reshelve it. The cover showed years of careful use. Eleanor had read that novel so many times, the spine always leaned slightly to the left. My fingers paused before opening it, almost expecting to smell the lavender hand lotion she favored while reading on our porch. Instead, something thin drifted onto the circulation desk. A pressed maple leaf, not brittle enough to have been there for years, still carrying a faded shade of copper. My throat tightened. Eleanor never used ordinary bookmarks in her favorite books. Every October, she gathered the prettiest maple leaves from the tree outside our house, pressed them between wax paper, and slipped one into each novel she planned to reread. I had teased her about it for decades, and she always smiled before saying, "Stories deserve seasons, too." Margaret watched my expression, but wisely said nothing. I opened the book more carefully. Near the middle of the novel, tucked neatly between two chapters, rested a folded note written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to anyone by name. It simply read, "If today feels heavier than yesterday, don't measure your bomb by this chapter alone. Keep turning pages. Some endings arrive quietly." I read it twice before I realized my hands were shaking. "I've never seen that before," Margaret whispered. Neither had I. Eleanor and I shared nearly 43 years together, yet I had never found a note hidden inside one of her books. Had she begun leaving them after I went to work? Had she wanted strangers to find them? Or had she written them for someone she believed needed hope more than explanations? As I carefully refolded the note, something else caught my attention. The checkout slip inside the back cover listed every borrower for library staff reference. One name had been redacted for privacy. But the same anonymous borrower had checked out this book, then the second title, and finally the third. Someone wasn't simply reading Eleanor's favorite novels. Someone was following her trail. My first instinct was to ask Margaret to tell me who had borrowed the books, but years of handling military inventories had taught me another lesson. The fastest question rarely produced the most reliable answer. People became defensive when they believed they were protecting someone else's privacy. So instead of pressing her, I folded Eleanor's note, handed it back, and nodded toward the computer. "If this really is a software problem," I said, "then let's assume that's all it is." I even managed a tired smile. "I'd hate to make more work for you over a glitch." The relief on Margaret's face told me I had made the right choice. She relaxed immediately, thanked me for understanding, and promised the technical department would investigate the account. She believed the matter was nearly finished. For me, it had only begun. Before leaving, I wandered through the history section where Eleanor used to wait while I searched for books about Marine campaigns and supply logistics. The building still smelled of polished wood and old paper. Every aisle held some small memory I hadn't expected to revisit. Near the community bulletin board, I noticed a colorful poster announcing the annual River County Reading Celebration. Eleanor had volunteered there every summer. According to the notice, the event would begin in 5 days of days. Deadlines always sharpened my thinking. I thanked Margaret again and drove home, resisting the temptation to return the next morning and demand answers. Patience had saved more operations than impatience ever had. Instead, I unlocked Eleanor's cedar keepsake box that evening. Inside rested her reading glasses, a faded library card, and several small bundles of pressed maple leaves wrapped in wax paper. The card itself had clearly never left the box after her funeral. Whatever activity appeared in the system had not come from someone stealing the physical card. That realization destroyed my first theory. It wasn't identity theft. The next morning, I returned to the library carrying a grocery bag filled with books Eleanor had donated years before, but somehow kept in our attic after a neighborhood sale was canceled. Margaret greeted me warmly. "I thought these might help your fundraiser," I said. "They certainly will." As she processed the donations, I quietly observed the circulation desk. The same anonymous account from yesterday wasn't visible, but I noticed something else. Every time one particular patron approached the counter, Margaret automatically set aside a reserved book before he even spoke. He was in his early 40s, wearing a grease-stained work shirt, with the logo of Brooks Auto Repair stitched over the pocket. His shoulders carried the exhausted posture of someone sleeping too little rather than working too much. He accepted the novel with a grateful smile. The title was the fourth reservation from Eleanor's account. I immediately convinced myself I had found the answer. He must have known Eleanor. Perhaps she had mentored him through the reading program, and he was quietly continuing her tradition. It seemed to fit every clue. Then Margaret leaned toward me after he walked away. "Poor fellow," she whispered. "Daniel only joined our reading program this winter." This winter. Months after Eleanor died. My neat explanation collapsed in an instant. If Daniel hadn't even started coming to the library until after Eleanor's funeral, how had he ended up following every book in her impossible trail? I waited until Daniel finished checking out his book before following him into the parking lot, but I stopped several steps behind. Grief teaches you that everyone carries a story you cannot see, and I had already been wrong once. "Excuse me," I called. He turned cautiously, still holding the novel against his chest. "I'm Thomas Reed." His eyes searched my face, trying to place the name. "My wife used to spend a lot of time here." That seemed safer than explaining everything at once. "I noticed you're reading one of her favorite books." His guarded expression softened. "Then your wife had excellent taste." He smiled politely, but it faded almost as quickly as it appeared. "These books have helped me." There was no performance in his voice, only exhaustion. I asked whether he had known Eleanor. He shook his head immediately. "No, sir. I wish I had." We ended up sitting on a weathered bench beneath the old maple tree outside the library. After several quiet moments, Daniel told me his story in pieces rather than speeches. His wife had died unexpectedly the previous winter. For months, he went to work at the repair shop, returned to an empty house, and spoke to almost no one. One afternoon, he wandered into the library simply because it was warm and quiet. A librarian recommended a novel that someone else had recently returned. Halfway through it, he found a folded note. "If today feels heavier than yesterday, don't measure your life by this chapter alone." He admitted he had cried so hard he had to close the book. "I thought whoever wrote it understood exactly where I was," he said. "The next book I borrowed had another note, then another." He looked embarrassed, almost apologetic. I started checking out whatever title had the same little pressed leaf inside it. The maple leaf. the symbol Eleanor had tucked into every autumn book. I felt my chest tighten, not with pain this time, but with recognition. Daniel had never been following my wife. He had been following Hope. I asked whether he had kept any of the notes. "No," he answered. "I always left them where I found them. I figured the next person might need them more than I did." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then one question finally escaped me. "Did anyone ever tell you who wrote them?" He smiled sadly. "I don't think that matters as much as the fact that someone did." When I returned inside, Margaret was waiting near the circulation desk with a cardboard archive box resting on a rolling cart. "I found something while looking through old outreach files," she said. Inside were volunteer folders from previous community reading programs. Eleanor's handwriting covered attendance sheets, suggested reading lists, and pages of personal reminders. Near the bottom lay a thin notebook labeled Hope Shelf Project. Margaret opened it carefully. Every title matched the borrowing sequence we had already discovered. Beside each book, Eleanor had written a short note to herself. "Leave encouragement between chapters 12 and 13. Use maple leaf so readers know this belongs to the same journey. Never sign my name. The words should matter more than the writer." I suddenly understood why I had never seen the notes at home. She hadn't been hiding them from me. She had been protecting the strangers they were meant to reach. Before I could absorb that realization, Margaret's expression changed. "There is something else you need to know." She pulled a meeting agenda from the archive box. The library board would vote in 5 days on eliminating several community outreach programs because of budget reductions. The Hope Shelf Project was first on the list. If it disappeared, Eleanor's quiet chain of encouragement would end with it. I folded the agenda and slipped it into my jacket. For the first time since the phone call, I realized the mystery was no longer simply about discovering what Eleanor had done. It had become about whether I could keep her work alive. I drove home with Eleanor's notebook resting on the passenger seat, yet I never opened it again during the trip. Some discoveries deserve silence before they deserve analysis. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the excitement of finally understanding part of her secret had given way to something heavier. If the Hope Shelf Project disappeared at the board meeting, Eleanor's quiet promise to strangers would disappear with it. I had spent most of my adult life protecting shipments, schedules, and people under my responsibility. Now the only mission that mattered belonged to someone who was no longer alive to defend it herself. The following morning, I returned to the library carrying a legal pad instead of questions. Emotion would not persuade a budget committee. Evidence might. Margaret had already assembled everything she was authorized to share. Volunteer attendance sheets, community reading schedules, anonymous participation surveys. None of them mentioned the hidden notes directly, but together they revealed something remarkable. Readers who borrowed books from Eleanor's carefully selected list returned to the library far more often than first-time visitors. Many eventually joined discussion groups or volunteered themselves. The numbers were modest, but they formed a consistent pattern stretching back several years. Then the setback arrived. Victor Harlan, the library board treasurer, entered the archive room carrying a binder under one arm. He greeted Margaret politely before noticing me. "You must be Mr. Reed," he said. "I've heard about the account confusion. I'm very sorry for your loss." His voice carried genuine sympathy, which made the conversation harder rather than easier. When Margaret explained that we were reviewing historical outreach files, Victor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm afraid those records need to stay in administrative custody until next week's budget meeting, he said. We've already begun consolidating program materials. Margaret hesitated. So we should stop? For now. He never raised his voice. He simply closed the archive box, thanked us for understanding, and wheeled it into a locked office. Legally, he had every right. Emotionally, it felt like watching someone close a door on Eleanor all over again. Outside, I sat beneath the same maple tree where Daniel and I had talked. For the first time since this mystery began, I wondered whether I had mistaken purpose for grief. Maybe preserving Eleanor's notes mattered only to me. Maybe libraries really couldn't afford programs whose value depended on stories instead of spreadsheets. Daniel found me there an hour later, carrying another borrowed novel. You look like someone just canceled tomorrow, he said quietly. I told him about the meeting. I expected anger. Instead, he asked a simple question. Did your wife ever want credit? I thought about the notebook, about the line she had written beneath every reading list. Never sign my name. No, I admitted. Then maybe don't fight for her name, Daniel replied. Fight for the people who haven't found those notes yet. His words changed my direction. That afternoon, I drove to 3 addresses listed in old volunteer appreciation letters Margaret had copied before the archive was locked away. I wasn't searching for opinions. I was searching for outcomes. At the first house, an elderly widow told me Eleanor had convinced her to attend the reading circle after losing her sister. At the second, a retired school bus driver explained that the library had become the first place he felt welcome after caring for his wife through dementia. Neither knew anything about hidden notes, but both described the outreach program as the reason they had rebuilt friendships after devastating loss. Their stories weren't dramatic. They were measurable in a different way. People had returned. Lives had slowly expanded again. As evening settled over town, I opened Eleanor's keepsake box once more. Beneath the remaining maple leaves lay a folded envelope I had somehow overlooked before. Inside wasn't another note of encouragement. It was a handwritten list titled simply, Readers willing to speak if the program is ever questioned. Every name on it matched someone still living in our community. For the first time, I realized Eleanor hadn't relied on hope alone. She had quietly prepared for the day someone might ask whether kindness could be proven. The next 2 days became the busiest I had experienced since retiring from warehouse management. Instead of organizing freight schedules, I organized memories, names, dates, and documents. Eleanor's handwritten list became my route map across town. I visited every person willing to speak, not asking them to defend my wife, but asking a simpler question. Would you tell the library board what this program meant to you? One after another, they agreed. An elderly veteran admitted the weekly reading circle had been the first place he had spoken openly after losing his brother. A young mother explained that quiet afternoons in the library helped her daughter recover confidence after months of severe anxiety. None of them mentioned hidden notes, because none of them had found one. Yet every story pointed to the same conclusion. Eleanor had built something much larger than a collection of encouraging messages. She had quietly built a community. Back at the library, Margaret found one more piece of evidence before the administrative files were sealed for the meeting. Tucked inside an old annual report was a spreadsheet Eleanor had helped compile. It compared attendance over several years, showing that readers who entered through the Hope Shelf Project returned more frequently than expected and often became volunteers themselves. The numbers alone would never stir emotions, but together with the personal testimonies, they transformed discovery into proof. For the first time, I had evidence that belonged not only to the mystery, but also to the decision the board was about to make. Victor Harlan crossed paths with me that afternoon in the lobby. He stopped beside the display table where volunteers were arranging donated books. "I hear you've been speaking with quite a few people," he said politely. "I've been listening," I answered. He folded his hands in front of him. "Mr. Reed, I hope you understand this isn't personal. Every organization reaches a point where sentiment has to give way to sustainability." His words were calm, reasonable, technically true. "If programs can't demonstrate measurable value," he continued, "the responsible decision is to redirect resources where they'll help more people." I looked at him for several seconds before replying. "I agree." He seemed almost surprised. There was no argument, no accusation, no attempt to convince him otherwise. I thanked him for the conversation and walked away. That was exactly what I wanted him to see. A retired widower who had finally accepted the inevitable. Later, Margaret caught up with me near the circulation desk. "You gave up awfully quickly." I smiled faintly. "No, I stopped arguing before anyone stopped listening." She understood immediately. By remaining calm, I had protected every person who had agreed to speak. No rumors would spread. No one would feel pressured before the meeting. Victor believed the discussion would revolve around spreadsheets and budget lines. He had no reason to expect anything different. That evening, Daniel stopped by my house carrying the 4th novel from Eleanor's reading list. "I thought you'd want this before tomorrow," he said. Inside, the final hidden note rested beneath another pressed maple leaf. It read, "Hope survives because ordinary people quietly choose each other again and again." Daniel closed the book gently. "Do you ever wonder whether your wife knew someone would eventually need all this?" I looked toward Eleanor's empty reading chair beside the window. "I wonder something different," I admitted. How many people almost gave up before one small act of kindness reached them? The question lingered long after Daniel left. The morning of the board meeting arrived gray and cool. I carried only a slim folder containing copies of attendance records, Eleanor's outreach notebook, the circulation data, and signed statements from the readers who had agreed to speak. The originals remained safely with the library. When I entered the meeting room, Victor greeted me with a sympathetic nod, clearly expecting a brief farewell to a program already destined for cancellation. I returned the nod, took a seat in the back row, folded my hands, and waited. The board meeting began exactly on time, just as I expected. Victor Harlan reviewed the agenda with practiced efficiency, moving through maintenance costs, staffing updates, and quarterly expenses before reaching the proposal to discontinue several outreach initiatives. The Hope Shelf project occupied less than a single page in the packet. According to the summary, participation could not be reliably measured, volunteer coordination required staff hours, and limited funding should be redirected toward programs with stronger documented returns. Nothing Victor presented was dishonest. In fact, every number on the screen was accurate. The problem was that the numbers described transactions while completely missing transformation. When the board chair invited public comments, the room remained quiet for several seconds. Victor glanced around with the calm confidence of someone expecting routine approval. Then I stood. My name is Thomas Reed, I said. My wife, Eleanor, volunteered here for many years. Several members nodded politely. I didn't come here to ask for special treatment because she passed away. I placed my folder on the table without opening it. I came because the information you're using is incomplete. Victor leaned forward. Mr. Reed, the financial reports have already been audited. I don't doubt that. I opened the folder and slid copies of Eleanor's outreach notebook toward each board member. What hasn't been audited is what happened after people borrowed the books. The chair accepted the notebook first. The others followed. No dramatic speeches, no accusations, only evidence. Margaret then distributed circulation summaries showing that readers who entered through Eleanor's recommended reading lists consistently returned to the library, joined discussion groups, and later volunteered. The pattern stretched across multiple years. The board members began comparing pages instead of watching Victor. He cleared his throat. Those figures show correlation, not necessarily causation. They do, I answered. That's why I brought something else. The first speaker was Mrs. Helen Morris, the widow I had visited 3 days earlier. She slowly approached the podium with both hands resting on her cane. I lost my sister, she said quietly. I stopped leaving my house except for groceries. Someone at this library encouraged me to attend a reading afternoon. Nobody forced me. Nobody promised miracles. They simply saved me a chair. She smiled through damp eyes. I've been coming every Tuesday for 4 years. She returned to her seat without another word. Then came the retired school bus driver. Then the Marine veteran. Then a young mother whose daughter had rediscovered the confidence to read aloud because volunteers patiently listened without judging her mistakes. None of them mentioned Eleanor by name. None knew about the hidden notes. Their stories belonged to the program itself. Victor remained composed, but I noticed him quietly setting aside the budget summary he had relied upon only minutes earlier. The unexpected complication arrived when another board member asked, "Personal testimony is valuable, but do we have evidence these experiences connect to the Hope Shelf project specifically?" It was a fair question. For one uncomfortable moment, the room became silent. Then Daniel stood. I can answer that. He walked to the podium holding the 4th novel from Eleanor's reading list. I never met the woman who started this. He carefully opened the book. A pressed maple leaf slipped onto the podium. Beneath it rested Eleanor's handwritten note. Daniel didn't read the entire message. Instead, he looked around the room and simply said, I found words like these after my wife died. I kept borrowing the next book because I hoped there might be another reminder that surviving one difficult chapter wasn't the end of the story. He closed the novel gently. I left every note exactly where I found it, because I believed someone else might need it next. Margaret then confirmed that Eleanor's outreach notebook documented the sequence of titles, the maple leaf marker, and her instruction never to sign her name because the encouragement mattered more than the author. Suddenly, the borrowing records, circulation data, volunteer attendance, anonymous notes, and personal testimonies all connected into one continuous chain. Discovery had become evidence. The board chair looked toward Victor. Would eliminating this program also eliminate this reading sequence? Victor remained silent for several seconds before answering honestly. Yes. The room changed. Not through outrage, through understanding. The proposal to eliminate the Hope Shelf project was withdrawn before the vote reached the floor. Another motion immediately followed, directing staff to preserve the outreach initiative while developing appropriate methods to measure both participation and community impact. The scheme to reduce the program had quietly collapsed. Applause filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to join it. Everyone now knew what Eleanor had quietly built. The only question I still couldn't answer was whether I was ready to let the rest of the community share the part of her that I had only just discovered myself. A week after the meeting, Margaret invited me back to the library before opening hours. The building was quiet except for the familiar creak of wooden floors settling into the morning. She led me to a newly arranged corner near the reading room, where a simple oak bookshelf stood beneath a modest brass plaque. It didn't bear Eleanor's photograph, and it didn't describe her life in glowing paragraphs. Just a few carefully chosen words. Hope Shelf. In honor of those who believe stories can carry kindness forward. I smiled because that was exactly what Eleanor would have wanted. Anonymous enough to keep the attention on the readers, meaningful enough to remind them they were never alone. Margaret handed me the cedar keepsake box. "I think this still belongs to you," she said softly. I opened it and looked at the remaining bundle of pressed maple leaves. For a long moment I considered taking everything home, protecting every note as if grief had earned me exclusive ownership. Then I remembered Daniel's words beneath the maple tree. Fight for the people who haven't found those notes yet. One by one, I placed Eleanor's handwritten messages inside the books she had chosen years before. I left every maple leaf exactly where she would have tucked it, between chapters that arrived just before hope seemed impossible. I signed nothing. Neither had she. Before I closed the last novel, I slipped the final pressed maple leaf between its pages. It was the only one I had kept untouched since the day she died. This time, letting it go hurt more than any board meeting or overdue phone call ever had. It also felt strangely peaceful. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, carrying a fresh stack of returned books. Without a word, he reshelved them beside the others. Somewhere in the coming weeks, another stranger would borrow one, discover an unexpected note, and perhaps decide to keep turning pages in life as well as in the story. As I walked toward the exit, sunlight spilled through the front windows onto Eleanor's favorite reading chair. For the first time in months, I didn't imagine her absence there. I imagined the quiet work she had left behind, continuing without applause, without recognition, and without needing me to explain it. Some legacies are built from buildings, savings, or family names. The finest one my wife ever created fit inside borrowed books. If this story reminded you that even the smallest act of kindness can outlive us, I hope you'll return for another quiet story with me. Until then, may you always find hope waiting on the next page, and may peace walk beside you wherever life leads.